Many of the big inspirations for the Xeno series on the sci-fi side of things are classic novels and films in the genre that take place in Earth's own future and have fictional elements only begin to enter the setting at a time contemporary to the work's original publishing. Something like this is actually true in a lot of cases in Xeno as well, so I figured, why not go through all of the Earths in the Xeno series and try to examine when real-world history stopped being exactly how things went in that universe and the fictional elements entered instead. This will require spoilers for every single Xeno game. This does include Gears and Saga. No Genesis yet, obviously. But I'm not going in release order this time. I'm going in order of least to most complicated to figure out the time. One very crucial detail you need to remember before I start any of this stuff is that the writing for games started a lot sooner than when they were actually released. Yes, development cycles in the old days were much shorter than they are now, but I'm pretty sure Takahashi, Saga, and Kato didn't know what events would take place in January 1998, the month before Xenogears released, when they got the go-ahead to turn the scrapped Final Fantasy VII pitch into its own game in late 95 or early 96. So while the divergence point that introduces actual fictional elements is likely going to be after each game's release date, that doesn't necessarily mean the mundane history up to that point is going to be identical to the real world, because the people writing the game couldn't predict the future up until the divergence point when they wrote it. That being said, both Earths in the Blade series have received updates adding more information on them after the game's initial release, so I don't know exactly how to classify that, but I'll get more in depth into something about that when I get to the Blade games. But the least complicated one by far is Xenogears, and this one gets a major boost by us not really knowing anything about the Earth era of humanity in the Gears universe. Now yes, we can make some educated guesses, especially based on Saga, and we know for sure that there are a lot of elements in Saga that are based on scrapped concepts for the wider Gears universe that never got to happen. But the Earth stuff specifically didn't make it into Perfect Works, so we don't know how much of the stuff about Earth in Saga actually has analogous stuff in Gears. Which basically means we have one thing to go off of, and that is the Zohar being discovered on Earth in the year 2001. I think most people, at least subconsciously, are aware that the Zohar in Saga, and therefore the Conduit and Blade, were inspired by the Monolith in 2001: A Space Odyssey, and therefore Monolith Soft themselves are indirectly named after it. But you have to remember, especially if you're a Blade-only fan who ignored the spoiler warning, the further back you go in Xeno series history, the less subtle the references to other properties the series makes are. You only need to look at the absurd amount of Gears references in the Saga series itself they somehow managed to get away with. And there's a lot of stuff in Gears too, like, even more in the original Japanese, because a lot of names, unintentionally and intentionally, did get changed in localization. Also, the Saga series just straight up has a character named Sellers, whose design is Peter Sellers as Dr. Strangelove. Like, this is as blatant as if all the male Vandames in the Xenoblade series actually looked like Jean-Claude Van Damme, but then also in Xenoblade X, Jack Van Damme makes an offhand comment saying that this isn't what his real body looks like, he just put himself in a mimeosome that looks like real-world actor Jean-Claude Van Damme did. Now, am I using humor to just pad out the Xenogears section? Kind of, because literally the only Xenogears Earth events we know of are 2001, the Zohar is discovered. Skip all the way to 2510, humanity begins emigrating to space and adopts the Transcend Christ calendar system. And that's just it. In Saga's equivalent of such events, we learn about several important things that happened in between the Zohar discovery and humanity beginning to leave for space, as well as a whole lot more about the early Transcend Christ era before the games take place. Plus, we learn about the backstory of humanity, why Saga's universe is the way it is, and just straight up have confirmation about things the Zohar did in the past prior to its discovery in the 21st century. We don't get any of that in Gears, especially the pre-discovery past, so I am just left to say it has to be 2001 and nothing else. After that, humanity began using the Zohar for technology and experimentation, learned a whole lot more, and were able to go interstellar within about 500 years. And yeah, that is all we know, so that makes it the simplest. Now, as I mentioned, Saga has backstory about supernatural things prior to the modern discovery of the Zohar, and Xenoblade X, while we have probably the most accurate year besides Gears, also has an important cosmic backstory for humanity that is most likely not true in the real world. So that actually leaves Numbered Xenoblade as the next least complex to discuss. In this case, we are given two hints. The first is the Birth of a Universe cutscene having the date 20XX on it, and the second is the Siren model kit mentioning the Conduit was discovered on Earth in the early 21st century. The latter statement is obviously the more important one, because based on everything we've seen, it was at least a few years and a radical society shift in between the conduit's discovery and Klaus performing the experiment, so knowing we do have to limit the discovery to the early part is a big advantage. Another concept I'd like to bring in is the idea that the divergence point is always after the year in which the game is published, because it would be weird for this game about something happening in modern times that drastically changes humanity and society and shapes a fantastical JRPG world for characters to explore in the future, to have been based around something that happened last year if you're playing the game on release. Like, it just doesn't make sense for you to be playing a game where the divergence point isn't something that could theoretically happen in the future. This is, of course, independent from, but possibly contrasting with, the thing about the writers not being able to predict the future I mentioned earlier. Since Xenoblade 1 didn't give us a time frame or tell us the conduit existed, we have to look at Xenoblade 2 for this. The game released worldwide in 2017, and most likely started being written in late 2014 or early 2015, shortly before Xenoblade X launched in Japan. So I am of the opinion that the discovery of the conduit did not take place in that world until at least a couple years after 2017. Now, does the fact that Xenoblade 3 released in 2022 and Future Redeemed in 2023 have anything to do with this? I'm gonna say no on this one because of the nature of playing a game long after it first released. Like, Xenoblade 2 Nintendo Switch 2 Edition is out when you are watching this video, in 2026, but I don't think that and the new content it adds causes any change in the lower bound on the conduit's discovery I just set. Let's go back to Gears and its divergence point of 2001. I, who was born after 1998, obviously did not play Gears prior to the year 2001. In fact, I actually didn't play it until I was an adult in college who was already making videos on this channel and being a Xenoblade guy who was finally getting around to the earlier parts in the series. That doesn't change the initial intent of the developers to have had the divergence point be in 2001. The whole, ooh, this could happen in the near future thing only matters for people playing the game when it first comes out. It's the exact same principle as if I read the original 2001: A Space Odyssey novel in 2026. And this is where real-world events the writers of the game wouldn't be able to predict come into play. If we go 3 years past the release date like happened with Gears, that puts the conduit being discovered sometime in 2020. And there's the issue. We can reasonably assume the conduit was discovered on an archaeological expedition in Kenya, similar to how the Zohar was in Xenosaga. The problem with that is, of course, the writers of Xenoblade 2 could not have possibly predicted a global pandemic taking place in 2020, that most likely meant an archaeological expedition in Kenya being led by foreign researchers would not be as likely to do as much stuff that would lead to the discovery of something as big as the conduit in the real world. Then, on top of that, it's reasonable to assume that the AI simulations the Trinity processor's personalities were developed in were not in any way based on real-world generative AI that became a fad in the 2020s, because Malos didn't come out the core looking like piss-tinted Charlie Kirk. So either they started it over from scratch. This is the actual correct answer. I am making a joke here. Obviously, it is two completely different kinds of thing. Developing an actual sentient life form is vastly different from stealing art from people. Or the divergence point is before generative AI took off. So, like, in alternate 2020, where the pandemic didn't happen and the conduit was discovered, then that led to technology changing drastically? Something like that? Maybe. Can we simply speculate that the discovery didn't take place 3 years after the game was published? Of course. Generative AI could still exist, it just couldn't become the buzzword of choice of every financial person in the world and the only thing allowed to get funding by governments anymore for research on the newly discovered conduit to actually begin to take off. Something I personally like headcanoning, because I think it's kind of cute, is the idea that the memory of Klaus's world, the party of Future Redeemed is shown in that game, is actually contemporary to Future Redeemed's real-world release date of 2023. Of course, you just have to ignore the fact that May 16th, 2023 was not a Wednesday, but if you at least want to keep it close-ish to the game's release date, the next Wednesday, May 16th, is going to be in 2029. So if the flashback in Future Redeemed takes place then setting back a few years for society to begin to be changed by the conduit allows you to basically pick and choose when you want it to be discovered after Xenoblade 2's release date. Do you want it to be pre-pandemic? Do you want it to be in 2020 in a world where it doesn't exist? Or a couple years into it when travel restrictions are a bit looser? You could just take your pick. Of course, we don't actually know how much time passed between the conduit's discovery and the experiment, And if we look into the future, there will be Wednesday, May 16th every 5 to 11 years all the way up to 2096. And even that still gives enough wiggle room for the experiment to still take place within the 21st century. So it could be any of those years. But I kind of want to say that sticking with the near future thing, the future redeemed memory is either 2029 or 2035, and the discovery of the conduit was about a decade earlier than that. I think going any later than that runs the risk of the conduit's discovery being in what most people would not consider quote-unquote early 21st century, so this all just makes sense to me. Next up, I'm going to mention Xeno's saga, and that is because of the huge wrinkle of eternal recurrence. All of the history of Xeno's saga, including the Earth stuff, and then the later Transcend Christ stuff, has happened an unknown amount of times already before eternal recurrence resets everything. And that's all well and good, as long as the repeating history is mostly the same as the real world with minor fluctuations until the Zohar is discovered. And very much like a midpoint between Gears and Blade, in Saga, the Zohar is discovered in Kenya in the year 20XX, and then humanity takes to the stars and adopts Transcend Christ in the year 2510. The problem with that is we know Wilhelm did a whole bunch of stuff long before then, and we also know that Jesus did a whole bunch of things that I think even the most out there interpretation of Christianity won't agree he did. Like sure, even though the dates were off by a few years, secular historians tend to agree that a person called Jesus of Nazareth did exist and was thought to be the Son of God who performed a whole bunch of miracles. First off, Xeno's Saga says the miracles definitely happened, but also that he wasn't the one who did them. That was chaos. And secondly, I don't care what denomination you are, the words imaginary number domain, power of anima, and lemegeton are not in your Bible. And yes, you could still argue that, okay, that is simply additional information Jesus and his followers had in the Xeno Saga universe they didn't have in the real world. Chaos existing obviously wasn't a thing in the real world, but he did not affect history in any way up until long after the present day. Except for the fact that Wilhelm definitely was affecting history the entire time. The present-day CEO of Vector is not the first time he took human form. He was also the founder of Vector back on Earth, presumably he's pretending to be his own descendant throughout history and is just staying in the family. He was also the founder of Ormus, a faction that does not exist in the real world, and was said to have been formed while Jesus was still alive. And he also just straight up apparently was multiple influential historical figures, including, quote, an emperor at the time of the Messiah, end quote, heavily implied to be Nero. So, you know, if a real-world historical figure from the ancient past was secretly a Xenosaga character the entire time, how do we even consider the point of divergence? Like, yes, in practice, as far as recorded history would go, the divergence point is early 21st century when the Zohar was discovered, almost certainly later than 2001, as Xenosaga 1 was a 2002 game. I want to say early 2010s just because they knew they'd be getting multiple entries this time right off the bat, even if it was a much more abridged series than they wanted initially. And before when it was discovered in numbered Xenoblade, which I'm just going to say is a nebulous 2020 to 2030. In objective reality, though, the divergence point is the Big Bang, as Wilhelm and Chaos existed in some form since then. But alright, what if you wind all the way back and just go to the first loop before Eternal Recurrence, before Zarathustra? Because, like, how did the Compass of Order of Chaos, how did Zarathustra, how did the Zohar get created in the first place? Well, we don't really know. We only know their exact history within the current loop of recurrence because most people's memories get reset, and if Chaos and Udu know, it doesn't seem like they're going to share. Yeah, Wilhelm existed in the first loop, but we also don't know if the Earth history in the first loop was remotely similar to how it was in reality at all. Like, when history repeats, it is supposed to repeat the same every single time because it is the same consciousnesses getting reset, forgetting everything, and being reborn in human form. But there had to be subtle differences each time. As far as I can tell, there's nothing preventing that. Like, the loop in which Xenosaga takes place and Cosmos is able to break free of Eternal Recurrence and stop Zarathustra is not the first time something has been different. So I'm guessing that with the probably thousands of times everything's been reset, the subtle changes very, very slowly crept to the point where it was a mostly identical to reality Earth history prior to the Zohar being discovered that led into Xenosaga. So in the first loop, how similar to reality was it? We don't know. Could, theoretically, Emperor Nero have actually been a real person, and in later loops Wilhelm just usurped his place to make sure no subtle changes prevented Jesus from dying in the right way to set everything up for recurrence? Maybe. Was the first loop just straight up the real world until the heat death of the universe was rapidly approaching, Wilhelm and Chaos gained sentience, consciousness began to reject recurrence, and all of that stuff happened leading to the creation of Zarathustra, the Zohar, and all that, and everything got passed back into history, and in the next loop it would be seen as relics from the ancient past? I don't know. So, like, there are two answers. One is the divergence point is infinity in the past, and the other one is early 21st century in between Gears and Numbered Blade. Then we arrive at Xenoblade X, and you have to be questioning why I think this is the most complicated one to discuss, because we basically have an exact year. Elma arrived on Earth 30 years prior to something narration Lynn is talking about in Chapter 12. Now, once again, we run into the issue. Is it 2054, the year the Earth exploded, she's saying that in reference to, or 2056, the year humanity landed on Mira, she's saying that in reference to? I don't know. But either way, at some point, either in 2024 or current year, Elma lands on Earth, meets with the leaders of humanity in secret, and that allows humanity's technology and society to advance to the point where they're launching interstellar arc ships to try and escape the Ganglion Ghost War, only 30 years later. Well, if that's all that was, then this would be on par with, if not simpler than Gears. Except for the fact that we know the origins of humanity. Now, yes, in Saga, eternal recurrence happens, and Wilhelm does it because of consequences of the collective unconscious of humankind. However, eternal recurrence is the universe resetting with very, very subtle changes in human history alone, as far as we know it. So that means that everything up to the formation of life on Earth is virtually identical, every single loop. Humans evolve from other primates, exactly the same as in the real world. Every single loop. The actual evolutionary origins of humanity are the same as in the real world and are completely natural every single time. Sure, Wilhelm and Chaos are there the entire time, but it isn't until recorded human history where they do anything significant. In Xenoblade X, however, apparently humans are descended from a hyper-advanced, multiversal alien civilization. And not just humans, but seemingly all life on Earth, as the Klurians are also a Samar-connected race, and they have animals virtually identical to cats. Plus, there's a lot of life on Mira that is directly analogous to life on Earth, and so forth and so forth. Like, nothing that we hear indicates that humans' understanding of their own history and life and evolution in all biology is different from in the real world. So, like, single-celled proto-organisms must have existed on X's Earth in the past for people to, like, discover and learn the same things we did about them. But also humans are direct descendants of an already humanoid predecessor race, which is of course another common sci-fi trope. The hypothesis that the base organic compounds needed to form life out of non-living matter originated from space and landed on Earth via a comet or meteor or something like that is a valid one with no strong disproof that many scientists believe in, and is actively being investigated by theory, terrestrial experiments, and even recent space missions. But the plausible version of the hypothesis is that amino acids, or very basic single-celled organisms, arrived on Earth from space, not fully evolved sentient humanoid predecessor aliens starting life on Earth that somehow evolved into us as we are now. So unlike Saga, the supernatural stuff from ancient history is baked into the foundations of life on Earth itself, so we can't really say there's anything aligning with real history at all, except for the fact that every piece of information about Earth prior to Elma's arrival we get, without discussing the odds of everything turning out that way, especially if my theory that the Samarians are actually heavily evolved Earth humans from another universe is true, we can still technically say that Earth's history was the same as the real world in between the genesis of life and Elma's arrival on the planet, because in spite of all this, X is the one Xeno game where Earth itself doesn't have anything supernatural about it. Yes, the Samarians created life on it, but besides that, Earth is just normal Earth until Elma arrives, while the Zohar or Conduit was explicitly discovered on the Earth of every single other Xeno universe. Slightly unfortunate that the final answer for X is just kind of a superposition of everything is divergent and nothing is divergent until 2020 something, but I want to use X as a vehicle to talk about some other concept. And that is the idea that, no, actually, things diverged long before the inflection point of supernatural elements, because in each universe, humans who didn't exist at that time do exist. As in, if you look at the ages of all the Xenoblade X characters, by 2026, a large chunk of them would have been born already by now, and it's fairly reasonable to assume that these characters don't exist as real people in the real world. So, do we count stuff like that as a divergence from real history, or because there are so many humans, and the supernatural stuff is the real thing that actually causes macro-scale deviations from what the real-world future is going to be like, do we even count those as differences? Because sometimes it does get pretty substantial. Like, if we were in the Xenosaga timeline, the archaeologist T. Masuda would have already been born and likely already working as an archaeologist, so if we were in the Saga timeline, I could just look up an archaeology journal and probably find publications by him already. But because that person doesn't exist, that is already a difference between the real world and the Xenosaga world that is in place already regardless of when the actual Zohar discovery is supposed to take place in Saga's timeline. If this were numbered Xenoblade, it's highly likely Klaus and Galea would have been born already. And it's also fairly likely they do not exist in the real world. So can we truly say any of the Xeno games actually line up with real-world history at all, when they clearly have people who we know as a fact don't exist, long before the actual discovery of the Zohar or the arrival of Elma? I don't really have a good answer for this, but I think examining this through the lens of X is particularly interesting, because not only does it take place nearest in the future out of any game, but it also hits on things close to home, like critique of modern society, namely the United States, and mentions politics. And like, if you look at the ages of characters, Maurice Chosan not only should be alive and an adult already, but it's also fairly likely that if he is a career politician, he is already active in politics at a local level at least by now. So is the fact that he isn't already an elected official somewhere a big enough divergence to say that even without Elma having arrived when she should have, this world is already substantially different from X's? I don't know. But much, much higher level elected officials would certainly be a major diverging point. And that's kind of a key thing. Because the writers couldn't predict the future, much, much more important things, like the elections of US presidents, are going to be up in the air and likely diverge from the real world long, long before the actual big divergence point, such as Elma's arrival. Xenoblade 1 first released in 2010, and we know X underwent a large amount of revisions before eventually releasing in 2015. So that means that when the idea for this project was first set in stone, the most recent election we know as a fact took place was 2008. It is possible the first draft of X's script was done before the 2012 presidential election. And like, yeah, I would personally say the way the US is depicted in X is a fairly Obama-era view of the country, but that aside, even though Elma shows up in the mid-2020s, we can only be absolutely certain that the succession of US presidents was the same as in the real world through Barack Obama's first term. This isn't an instance of me trying to read into the political commentary made by the game. This is an instance of Takahashi not being able to predict the future like the Shulk he also invented. Even without Elma showing up, a cycle of 4 years is a long enough period of time where the butterfly effects caused by all of the Xenoblade X characters and their families who don't exist in the real world existing could completely change things without us knowing. Like, besides Obama inevitably also running in 2012, the only major presidential candidate from the 2012 election to the present day that I could say for sure still has a decent chance of having been president in X's timeline is Joe Biden, and only because he was Obama's vice president. Interestingly, you don't have to talk about this stuff when it comes to Gears, Saga, or Numbered Blade, because the main story of all those games is so far removed from the present day that things that happened on Earth in between when the game was written and the actual big divergence point with the conduit is much less important, and the only thing that really matters is society not undergoing a massive shift until after the Zohar or conduit's implementation into the world. And then, we have to consider the fact that the 2015 game that started being written around 2010 also got a 2025 update, and that update added new content. And that new content is in fact capable of commenting and making parallels to things that happened after the original game was written and took place. I'm of course talking about Kellerman here, who is pretty clearly supposed to be a stand-in for Elon Musk, as this is probably the most specific and least subtle piece of satire or commentary the Xeno series has done in like 20 years. So yeah, it's not hard to see what they were going for with this, and I don't think it's an accident that your allies against him are the lesbian Redditor power couple and their mobile suit Zeta Gundam, but also, you wouldn't make this kind of parody of him in a game that released in 2015, because general public knowledge and opinion of him was so different that it's highly unlikely someone would want to depict him in this way if they chose to reference him in something at all. But because the original game was written and released long before public opinion of him shifted to where a common depiction of him would be as Kellerman is the intervening history so different that he wouldn't have become like that in the first place? Like, is Kellerman just supposed to be a stand-in for Elon Musk, or did he take the role of Elon Musk in the present day in the real world, in X's world? I'm inclined to say no, only because he's only 49 years old during Xenoblade X itself, but it's interesting to think about. Like, again, the butterfly effect of so many fictional characters existing in the present day and needing to have all their own ancestors could have changed things so substantially that you don't have Tesla in SpaceX, you just have Granada Galactic Group instead. Kellerman's age, and also the fact that he is the head of R&D at Granada and not a, high-up business person, suggesting that he got promoted to that position from having actually been capable of doing R&D work himself at some point in time, heavily suggests that this is not the case. But if they wanted to explore other aspects of the world, then maybe they would have to do something like this. Say, for example, the developers wanted to have a reference to Disneyland in New Los Angeles. Well, clearly they can't just use actual Disneyland and reference the actual Disney company, but they would do what so many other pieces of media that do something like this do, and have a very obvious stand-in, make up an entertainment conglomerate as well as a fake theme park. But then, in that case, you just have to assume that this stand-in for Disney isn't just taking the place of Disneyland, but also fully occupied the position the Disney Corporation did in American culture and business during the entire history of Disney's real-world existence. So this is something having wide-reaching changes going back many, many decades before the actual divergence point. All things said, it doesn't seem like something like this actually happens anywhere in X, because American culture isn't really frequently discussed in detail besides things that are already in the public domain, or things that were explicitly created in the 2030s and beyond, so they wouldn't be under the purview of the whole divergence point thing. And also the fact that all of the tech companies we see are ones that are heavily implied to have been created after the boom caused by Elma providing Ares tech to the world, so it makes sense that they wouldn't exist in the present day. Examining it this way shows that the only thing that is actually out of step seeming is the fact that, big defense contractors that exist in the present day never show up in X, and big tech companies don't exist at all. We never see Apple being directly referenced, though I'm almost certain it would still be around in the setting of Xenoblade X. But at the same time, the whole world got unified under a coalition government, so it's possible private corporations were just rolled into the coalition government, and any representatives of anything besides the special independent companies that were formed after the fact is just under the purview of the NLA government and part of Blade. And that's how they get around having to reference your Apples, your Raytheons, your Boeings, and that kind of thing. And you could just say, yeah, it was Blade researchers and Sakuraba Industries that developed all the Skell stuff. Don't think about the fact that other companies should definitely still be around. This is a very, very big tangent off of the actual topic of the video, but I thought it was interesting and worth discussing, and maybe something that you should look into other near-future sci-fi things that aren't Xenoblade X, and see if you can find examples of all the kinds of things I talked about there, because doing this kind of thing isn't super relevant to X itself just because of what X is actually about and the events it covers, but it's a fascinating thing to imagine and see applied in other places. Until next time though, this is Luxon, signing off.